Kieran Blackwood had always believed that invisibility was his greatest asset. At Jefferson High School, a sprawling brick institution nestled in the suburbs of Denver, Colorado, he moved through the hallways like a shadow, his lean frame barely registering in the peripheral vision of his classmates. Standing just 5'6", with sandy brown hair that perpetually fell across his green eyes, Kieran possessed the kind of unremarkable appearance that made him forgettable in crowds. His clothes were always clean but never fashionable, his backpack worn but functional, and his voice rarely rose above a whisper unless called upon in class. What his fellow students didn't know was that beneath his quiet exterior lay years of rigorous training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Muay Thai. Every evening after school, while other students were playing video games or hanging out at the mall, Kieran could be found at Master Rodriguez's academy across town, perfecting his technique and building the kind of lean muscle that his loose-fitting clothes concealed. His grandfather had insisted on the training after Kieran's father died in Afghanistan, believing that every young man should know how to defend himself and others. But Kieran had made a promise to his mother never to use violence unless absolutely necessary, a promise that had kept his fists clenched at his sides through 3 years of high school. The trouble had started in his junior year when 3 seniors took notice of him. Blake Morrison was their leader, a thick-necked linebacker on the football team with arms like tree trunks and a smile that never reached his cold blue eyes. Standing 6'2" and weighing well over 200 pounds, Blake commanded respect through intimidation and had never met a problem he couldn't solve with his fists. His lieutenant was Trevor Walsh, a wiry kid with nervous energy who compensated for his smaller size by being twice as cruel as his leader. The third member of their group was Danny Reeves, a stocky wrestler who followed Blake around like a loyal dog, always ready to laugh at his jokes and back up his plays. It was a Tuesday morning in October when they first cornered Kieran near his locker in the south wing of the school. The hallway was emptying as students rushed to their first period classes, leaving Kieran alone with his books when Blake's massive shadow fell across his locker door. "Hey there, ghost boy," Blake said, his voice carrying the kind of casual menace that made other students quicken their pace. "You're in my spot." Kieran looked around the hallway, confused. He'd been using this locker for 2 months without incident. "I think there's been some mistake," he said quietly, not meeting Blake's eyes. "This is locker 247. It was assigned to me." Trevor stepped up beside Blake, cracking his knuckles with theatrical precision. "Doesn't matter what some paper says, freak. Blake wants this locker, so move your crap somewhere else." The rational part of Kieran's mind catalogued the tactical situation automatically. 3 opponents, confined space, multiple escape routes. He could have Blake on the ground in seconds, and the other 2 would follow. But his mother's voice echoed in his memory, pleading with him to promise that he would never become the kind of person who solved problems with violence. He'd given her that promise while she wept over his father's flag-draped coffin. "I don't want any trouble," Kieran said, closing his locker and shouldering his backpack. "I'll talk to the office about getting reassigned." Blake's laughter was sharp and ugly. "Look at that, boys. Kid's got no spine at all. This is going to be fun." As Kieran walked away, he heard Danny call out behind him, "See you round, ghost boy." Real soon. The name stuck. Within a week, half the school was calling him Ghost Boy, and Blake's crew had made it their personal mission to make his life miserable. They would knock his books from his hands in the hallway, accidentally bump into him at lunch, and corner him in empty classrooms to make threats that danced just on the edge of what teachers might overhear. Kieran endured it all in silence, his jaw clenched and his fists buried deep in his pockets. The worst incidents happened in 3 specific locations where teacher supervision was minimal. The first was the back stairwell near the gymnasium, a concrete echo chamber where Blake would corner Kieran between classes and deliver his daily dose of psychological torture. The second was behind the cafeteria dumpsters, where they would force him to eat lunch, standing up while they made jokes about his appearance and family situation. The third was the parking lot after school, where they would sometimes follow him to his beat-up Honda Civic and make sure he understood that his day of humiliation wasn't over just because the final bell had rung. "The thing about ghosts," Blake explained to him one afternoon as Trevor held Kieran's arms behind his back, "is that nobody cares when they disappear." Kieran's training kicked in automatically, showing him 12 different ways to break Trevor's grip and disable both attackers. But his mother's voice was stronger than his instincts. He went limp and waited for them to get bored, counting his breathing like Master Rodriguez had taught him, finding his center even as they laughed at his apparent helplessness. The pattern continued for weeks, escalating gradually as Blake grew more confident in Kieran's refusal to fight back. What had started as verbal intimidation evolved into physical harassment, though never quite crossing the line into outright assault. They would grab his shirt, shove him against lockers, or knock his food tray from his hands, but they were careful to make it look accidental to any teachers who might be watching. Kieran's grades began to suffer as he spent more energy avoiding his tormentors than focusing on his studies. He started taking longer routes between classes, eating lunch in empty classrooms, and leaving school through side exits to avoid confrontations. His teachers noticed his distraction but attributed it to typical teenage problems. The few students who witnessed the harassment looked away quickly, unwilling to risk becoming targets themselves. It was during this dark period that Kieran first noticed Sophia Chen sitting alone in the library during lunch period. She was new to Jefferson High, having transferred from California when her father's tech company relocated to Denver. Sophia had the kind of natural beauty that should have made her instantly popular, with long black hair that caught the light when she moved, and dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of intelligence and kindness. But her quiet nature and academic focus had kept her on the periphery of the social scene, much like Kieran himself. Their friendship began with small gestures. Kieran would hold doors for her in the hallway, and she would smile and nod her thanks. They began sitting at the same table in the library, not talking, but sharing the comfortable silence of two people who understood what it meant to be overlooked. Eventually, they started studying together, Sophia helping Kieran with calculus while he assisted her with American history. "You're different from the other guys here," Sophia told him one afternoon as they worked through a particularly difficult physics problem. "You actually listen when people talk." Kieran felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the October sunshine streaming through the library windows. For the first time in months, he looked forward to coming to school, knowing that he would see Sophia's smile and hear her laugh at his terrible jokes about their chemistry teacher's tendency to set things on fire. Their growing friendship didn't go unnoticed by Blake's crew. Trevor was the first to comment, cornering Kieran near the water fountain after third period. "Well, well, well," Trevor said, his voice carrying a nasty edge. "Ghost Boy's got himself a girlfriend. Pretty little thing too. Wonder how she'd feel if she knew what a pathetic loser you really are." Kieran's hands clenched involuntarily, but he forced his voice to remain steady. "Leave her out of this. She has nothing to do with whatever problem you have with me." "Oh, but that's where you're wrong," Trevor replied, stepping closer until Kieran could smell the energy drink on his breath. "See? Blake's been watching her too, and he thinks she might need some better company than a ghost. Maybe we should introduce ourselves properly." The threat hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that was about to spread out of control. Kieran felt something shift inside his chest, a cold anger that he'd never experienced before. His training had taught him that there were lines that should never be crossed, and threatening innocent people was at the top of that list. But before he could respond, The warning bell rang, and Trevor disappeared into the crowd of students moving toward their next class. Kieran stood by the water fountain for a long moment, his reflection distorted in the metal surface, trying to reconcile the promise he'd made to his mother with the growing certainty that his silence was no longer protecting anyone. That afternoon, Kieran watched Sophia from across the library as she worked on her English essay, completely unaware that she had become a target. The afternoon sunlight caught the highlights in her hair, and when she looked up and smiled at him, he felt his heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the first stirrings of something deeper than friendship. The next morning brought the incident that would change everything. Kieran was walking with Sophia between classes, carrying her books along with his own, when Blake appeared at the end of the hallway with his usual crew in tow. Other students seemed to sense the electricity in the air and cleared the corridor, leaving Kieran and Sophia alone with their tormentors. "Well, if it isn't the ghost and his pretty little shadow," Blake said, his voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet hallway. "Sophia, isn't it? I've been wanting to have a conversation with you about the company you've been keeping." Sophia stepped closer to Kieran, her instincts warning her that something was wrong, even if she didn't understand the full situation. "I'm sorry, do we know each other?" she asked, her voice polite but wary. "We're about to," Blake replied, his cold smile spreading across his face like ice forming on a lake. "See, your boyfriend here has been telling people some interesting stories about me and my friends. Thought you should know what kind of liar you're hanging around with." Kieran felt the familiar anger building in his chest, but this time it was different. This time it wasn't just about his own humiliation, it was about protecting someone who had done nothing wrong except show him kindness. "Sophia, just go to class," he said quietly. "This doesn't involve you." "Like hell it doesn't," Trevor interjected, moving to block Sophia's path to the stairwell. "Blake asked you a question, sweetheart. It would be rude not to answer." "I don't know what you're talking about," Sophia said, her voice growing stronger as her own anger began to surface. "Kieran's never mentioned any of you, and I don't appreciate being cornered in the hallway." Blake's laugh was sharp and ugly. "Oh, you've got some fire in you. I like that. Too bad you're wasting it on this pathetic excuse for a man." What happened next unfolded in slow motion from Kieran's perspective. Blake stepped forward and grabbed Kieran by the collar of his shirt, lifting him slightly off the ground with one massive fist. Kieran's feet barely touched the floor as Blake pulled him close, his face inches away from Kieran's. "Here's what's going to happen, ghost boy," Blake said, his voice low and menacing. "You're going to tell your girlfriend here exactly what a worthless piece of trash you are, and then you're going to walk away and leave her to people who can actually take care of her. Because if you don't, I'm going to make your life so miserable that you'll wish you'd never been born." Kieran's training screamed at him to break the grip, drive his elbow into Blake's solar plexus, and end the confrontation before it escalated further. Every muscle in his body was coiled and ready, his mind automatically calculating angles and leverage points. But his mother's voice was still there, pleading with him to find another way, to be better than the violence that had taken his father. Instead of fighting, Kieran forced his body to go limp, meeting Blake's cold stare with quiet defiance. "I'm not going to fight you," he said clearly, loud enough for the gathering crowd of students to hear, "and I'm not going to abandon my friend because you're too insecure to handle someone being happy." Blake's grip tightened, and for a moment, Kieran thought the bigger boy might actually hit him. But then Danny stepped forward, glancing nervously at the students who were starting to pull out their phones. "Blake, man, teachers are coming," Danny whispered urgently. "We should go." Blake held Kieran for another few seconds, letting the humiliation sink in before releasing him with a shove that sent him stumbling backward. Kieran caught himself against the wall, straightening his shirt with hands that didn't shake despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "This isn't over, ghost boy," Blake said as he walked away. Not even close. The hallway cleared quickly as students hurried to avoid being associated with the confrontation. Only Sophia remained, her dark eyes blazing with an anger that Kieran had never seen before. "How long has this been going on?" she demanded, following him as he gathered his scattered books from the floor. "It's not important," Kieran replied, not meeting her eyes. He could still feel Blake's hands on his collar, still hear the laughter of the students who had watched him be humiliated. "You should stay away from me for a while. This is my problem to deal with." "Like hell it is," Sophia shot back, echoing Trevor's earlier words, but with entirely different intent. "Nobody deserves to be treated like that, especially not someone as decent as you." Her words hit Kieran harder than any physical blow could have. For 3 years, he'd endured the harassment in silence, telling himself that it was the noble thing to do, that rising above the violence made him better than his tormentors. But watching the anger in Sophia's eyes, seeing how his refusal to fight back had now made her a target, he began to question whether his promise to his mother had become a prison of his own making. That evening, Kieran stood in Master Rodriguez's academy, working through his forms with a precision and intensity that made the other students give him a wide berth. His kicks snapped with the sound of controlled violence, his punches cut through the air like blades, and his grappling work against the heavy bag left impressions that would take hours to fade. "Your form is perfect, as always," Master Rodriguez observed, watching Kieran work through a complex combination that flowed from strikes to throws to ground control. "But your spirit is troubled. What weighs on your mind, young warrior?" Kieran paused in his training, sweat dripping from his face onto the mats that had been his second home for so many years. "Master, what if someone threatens someone you care about? What if your refusal to fight makes things worse instead of better?" The older man studied Kieran's face with the kind of perception that came from decades of teaching young people to channel their aggression into discipline. "Your father was a good man," he said finally, "but he was also a warrior who understood that sometimes the greatest violence is allowing evil to flourish unopposed. There is a difference between seeking violence and accepting it when it comes to your door." "My mother made me promise," Kieran said, his voice barely audible over the sounds of other students training around them. "Your mother feared losing you the way she lost your father," Master Rodriguez replied. "But she also raised you to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Sometimes, young warrior, the greatest honor lies not in keeping a promise, but in understanding when that promise must evolve." Kieran spent the rest of the evening working through his training with a new intensity, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences. By the time he left the academy, something fundamental had shifted in his perspective. He was still the same quiet, thoughtful person he'd always been, but now there was steel beneath the surface that hadn't been there before. The next few days passed in an uneasy calm that reminded Kieran of the stillness before a thunderstorm. Blake and his crew continued their psychological warfare, but they seemed to be waiting for something, building toward some grand gesture that would cement their dominance once and for all. Kieran continued to walk away from their confrontations, but now his retreats were strategic rather than submissive, his mind cataloging their patterns and weaknesses with the cold precision of someone preparing for war. Sophia noticed the change immediately. There was a different quality to Kieran's stillness now, a sense of coiled energy that hadn't been there before. When she commented on it, he simply smiled and changed the subject, but she caught him sometimes staring at Blake's table during lunch, with an expression that made her think of deep water hiding dangerous currents. The breaking point came on a Friday afternoon in November. Kieran had stayed late to make up a chemistry lab, and the halls were mostly empty when he finally gathered his things to leave. He was walking toward the parking lot when he heard voices coming from behind the cafeteria dumpsters, one of which he recognized with a chill that ran down his spine like ice water. "Come on, sweetheart, don't be shy." Blake's voice carried clearly in the cold air. "I just want to talk." Kieran dropped his backpack and moved toward the sound with the silent precision that Master Rodriguez had drilled into him over countless hours of training. He reached the corner of the building and peered around to see Blake standing uncomfortably close to Sophia, who had her back pressed against the brick wall. Trevor and Danny flanked her escape routes, their position suggesting this was a planned ambush rather than a chance encounter. "I told you, I'm not interested in talking to you," Sophia was saying, her voice steady despite the obvious fear in her posture. "Please just leave me alone." "See, that's where you're confused," Blake replied, placing one massive hand against the wall beside her head. "You don't get to make that choice anymore, not after your boyfriend embarrassed me in front of the whole school." Kieran's vision narrowed to a tunnel that contained only Blake's hand near Sophia's face and the fear in her eyes. Something cold and primal awakened in his chest, a fury that had nothing to do with his own humiliation and everything to do with the protection of someone innocent. In that moment, his mother's voice was replaced by his grandfather's teachings about the warrior's code, about the responsibility that came with the ability to do violence on behalf of those who couldn't defend themselves. He stepped around the corner, into the open space behind the dumpsters, his movement so quiet that none of them noticed him at first. When he spoke, his voice carried a quality that none of them had heard before. Calm and level, but with an undertone that made Trevor actually take a step backward. "Take your hands off her now." Blake turned around with that same cold smile, but something in Kieran's posture made him hesitate for just a moment before recovering his arrogance. Well, well, if it isn't the ghost boy himself, come to watch your girlfriend get what's coming to her. "I'm going to say this once more," Kieran replied, his voice never rising above conversational level. "Take your hands off her and walk away. This is your only warning." Blake's laughter was harsh and grating. "Or what? You'll run crying to mommy like you always do? Face it, ghost boy, you're nothing but a coward who hides behind women." Trevor and Danny had positioned themselves to cut off any retreat, clearly expecting another humiliating victory over their favorite victim. What none of them expected was for Kieran to step forward instead of backing down, moving with a fluid grace that seemed to transform him from harmless teenager into something altogether more dangerous. "Sophia," Kieran said without taking his eyes off Blake, "walk away. Go to the office and call security." "I'm not leaving you here with them," she replied firmly, though she edged away from Blake's looming presence. "You will if you trust me," Kieran said, and something in his tone made her comply, moving quickly toward the parking lot while pulling out her phone. Blake watched her go with amusement, clearly enjoying what he saw as another example of Kieran's weakness. "There she goes. Guess it's just us boys now." "That's fine," Kieran replied, settling into a stance that Master Rodriguez would have recognized as perfect fighting position. "I prefer it that way." For the first time, doubt flickered across Blake's face. There was something different about the smaller boy, a confidence that hadn't been there in any of their previous encounters. But he was still 50 pounds heavier and had never lost a fight in his life, so he dismissed the feeling and stepped forward with his fists raised. "Time to teach you a lesson you should have learned months ago," Blake snarled, throwing a looping right hand that would have knocked out most high school students. Kieran wasn't most high school students. He slipped the punch with minimal movement, his years of training making Blake's telegraphed attack look clumsy and slow. Before Blake could recover his balance, Kieran stepped inside his reach and drove a precise elbow strike into his solar plexus, driving all the air from his lungs in a single explosive breath. Blake doubled over, gasping, and Kieran could have ended the fight right there with a knee strike or hammer fist to the back of his neck. Instead, He stepped back and gave his opponent room to recover, his grandfather's teachings about honor holding him back from taking advantage of a helpless enemy. "Walk away, Blake," he said calmly. "This doesn't have to go any further." But Blake's rage had been building for months, fed by every moment that Kieran had refused to fight back, every humiliation that had been absorbed in silence. He straightened up with murder in his eyes and charged forward like an enraged bull. His superior size and weight turned into weapons. Kieran sidestepped the charge and used Blake's momentum against him, applying a hip throw that sent the bigger boy crashing into the side of the dumpster with a metallic clang that echoed across the parking lot. Blake hit the ground hard but rolled to his feet with the kind of athletic ability that had made him a star on the football team. Trevor and Danny started to move forward to help their leader, but Kieran's voice stopped them cold. "Stay back," he said without turning to look at them, his attention focused entirely on Blake. "This is between him and me." There was something in his tone that suggested very bad things would happen to anyone who interfered, and both smaller boys decided that discretion was the better part of valor. They backed up against the far wall, suddenly realizing that they might have misjudged their usual victim quite badly. Blake wiped blood from his lip where he'd bitten his tongue during the impact, his cold smile replaced by genuine fury. "You think you're tough now, Ghost Boy? Let me show you what real fighting looks like." He came forward more carefully this time, his hands up in a boxer's stance, throwing combinations that showed he'd had some training of his own. But his techniques were crude compared to Kieran's years of disciplined study, and his anger made him predictable. Kieran blocked and countered with surgical precision, landing strikes to nerve points and pressure centers that would leave Blake sore for weeks without causing permanent damage. Every move was controlled, every technique designed to disable rather than destroy. This wasn't the mindless violence that his mother had feared, it was the careful application of skills learned through discipline and dedication. The fight lasted less than 2 minutes, though it felt like an eternity to everyone watching. Blake threw everything he had at his smaller opponent, using his size and strength advantages to try to overwhelm Kieran's technique. But every attack was turned aside. Every aggressive move countered with just enough force to make Blake reconsider his approach. The end came when Blake, desperate and exhausted, tried one last bull rush to drive Kieran into the brick wall behind him. Kieran dropped low and swept Blake's legs out from under him, sending the bigger boy crashing to the asphalt with his arms tangled uselessly beneath him. Blake struggled to get up, his face scraped and his pride shattered, but his body had reached its limits. He collapsed back to the ground, gasping and defeated, looking up at Kieran with something approaching respect mixed with his hatred. Kieran stood over his fallen tormentor, his breathing barely elevated despite the intensity of the fight. He could have kicked Blake while he was down, could have delivered the kind of finishing move that would have left lasting damage. For a moment, the temptation was almost overwhelming. Instead, he stepped back and extended his hand to help Blake to his feet. "It's over," he said simply. "We don't have to be enemies." Blake stared at the offered hand for a long moment, his worldview cracking like ice in spring sunshine. Every instinct told him to reject the gesture, to find some way to salvage his pride and continue the conflict. But something in Kieran's eyes, a combination of strength and mercy that Blake had never seen before, made him reconsider. He took the offered hand and let Kieran pull him to his feet, both boys understanding that something fundamental had changed between them. Blake was still bigger, still stronger in pure physical terms, but he would never again be able to see Kieran as a victim. "How?" Blake asked, genuinely curious despite his humiliation. "How did you learn to fight like that?" "I've been training since I was 8, Kieran replied honestly, "but I never wanted to use it. My father died fighting, and my mother made me promise to find other ways to solve problems." "Then why now?" Trevor asked from his position against the wall, his voice small and uncertain. Kieran looked over at him with eyes that held depths of controlled fire. Because some things are worth fighting for, and some people need to be protected whether they can protect themselves or not. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air as Sophia returned with school security and a police car that had been patrolling the area. The three bullies exchanged glances, realizing that their usual strategy of claiming self-defense wouldn't work when the evidence clearly showed who had been the aggressor. But before the authorities could reach them, Blake did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He looked directly at Kieran and spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the parking lot. "I started this fight," he said simply. "These guys were just here. It was all me." Trevor and Danny stared at their leader in shock, but Blake ignored them, his attention focused entirely on Kieran. There was something in his expression that might have been respect, or perhaps just the recognition that true strength didn't always come from size and aggression. When the security guards and police officers arrived, they found a scene that didn't match anyone's expectations. Blake sat against the dumpster with his cuts and scrapes, looking more thoughtful than angry. Trevor and Danny stood nearby, subdued and uncertain, and Kieran stood calmly beside Sophia, his clothes barely mussed, despite having just won the most decisive fight in Jefferson High's recent memory. The aftermath was surprisingly anticlimactic. Blake's confession, combined with witness testimony and Sophia's phone video of the confrontation's beginning, made the situation clear to everyone involved. Blake received a suspension and was required to attend anger management counseling. Trevor and Danny got detention and stern warnings about their future conduct. Kieran received no punishment at all, his actions clearly falling under the school's self-defense policies. More importantly, word of the fight spread through the school with the speed that only teenage gossip could achieve, carrying with it a new understanding of who Kieran Blackwood really was. The change in school dynamics was immediate and profound. Students who had ignored Kieran for 3 years suddenly found reasons to talk to him, not out of fear, but out of genuine respect for someone who had been strong enough to endure harassment without becoming a harasser himself. Teachers who had seen him as a quiet underachiever began to recognize the depth of character that had allowed him to maintain his principles even under extreme pressure. Most importantly, Sophia looked at him with new eyes, seeing not just the gentle boy who had helped her with homework, but the young man who had risked everything to protect her from harm. Their friendship deepened into something more over the following weeks, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared understanding that neither of them had found with anyone else. Blake himself underwent the most dramatic transformation. The humiliation of his defeat, combined with the unexpected mercy Kieran had shown him, forced him to confront aspects of his personality that he had never examined before. He began attending the anger management sessions with genuine commitment rather than sullen compliance, and slowly started to understand the difference between strength and bullying. One afternoon in December, nearly a month after their confrontation, Blake approached Kieran's lunch table with obvious nervousness. The cafeteria conversation died as students waited to see what would happen between the former enemies. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Blake asked, his voice lacking the arrogance that had once defined him. Kieran looked up from his sandwich, studying Blake's face for signs of deception or continued hostility. Finding none, he nodded and stood up, following Blake to a quiet corner of the cafeteria where they could speak privately. "I owe you an apology," Blake said without preamble. "Not just for that day behind the dumpsters, but for everything, the whole year. I was wrong, and I knew I was wrong, but I kept doing it anyway because I thought that's what made me strong." Kieran listened without interruption, recognizing the difficulty it must have taken for someone like Blake to make such an admission. "I also wanted to thank you," Blake continued, his voice dropping even lower. You could have really hurt me that day. Hell, you could have destroyed me. But you didn't. That showed me something about real strength that I'd never understood before. We all make mistakes, Kieran replied simply. The important thing is what we do after we recognize them. Blake nodded, extending his hand in a gesture that mirrored Kieran's offer of help after their fight. I don't expect us to be friends. I know I don't deserve that, but I want you to know that you'll never have any trouble from me again, and if anyone else tries to give you trouble, they'll have to go through me first. Kieran shook the offered hand, feeling the genuine strength in Blake's grip, and recognizing it as something entirely different from the intimidation it had once represented. I'd like to think we could be friends eventually, he said. Everyone deserves a second chance. The conversation between former enemies was witnessed by most of the cafeteria, and word spread quickly throughout the school. By the end of the day, everyone at Jefferson High understood that a new order had been established, one based on respect rather than fear, strength rather than bullying. Kieran's transformation from invisible ghost to respected student became a legend that would be told and retold for years after his graduation. But more importantly, it became an example for other students who found themselves in similar situations, proof that it was possible to stand up for yourself and others without losing your essential humanity in the process. As winter turned to spring, Kieran reflected on the lessons he had learned during those dark months of harassment and the bright moment of his triumph. He had discovered that true strength wasn't just about the ability to inflict harm, but about the wisdom to know when harm was necessary and the restraint to use only as much force as the situation required. His relationship with Sophia continued to deepen, built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared values that made them natural partners in both academic and personal pursuits. She never asked him to be anything other than who he was, and he never tried to be anything other than authentic in her presence. On graduation day, as Kieran walked across the stage to receive his diploma, he caught sight of Blake in the audience, applauding with genuine enthusiasm. Their eyes met for a moment, and Blake offered a small nod of respect that spoke volumes about how far both young men had traveled from that dark day behind the cafeteria dumpsters. Kieran's mother was in the audience as well, tears of pride streaming down her face as she watched her son accept his diploma and the recognition that came with being named one of Jefferson High's outstanding graduates. After the ceremony, she hugged him tightly and whispered that his father would have been proud of the man he had become. "I kept my promise, Mom," Kieran said quietly. "I never became the kind of person who uses violence to solve problems, but I also learned that sometimes refusing to use violence creates bigger problems for people who can't protect themselves." His mother smiled through her tears, understanding finally that her son had found a way to honor both his father's warrior spirit and her desire for him to be a man of peace. "You found your own path," she said. "That's all any parent can hope for." As Kieran looked out at his classmates and their families celebrating the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal victory and everything to do with the knowledge that he had remained true to his principles while still standing up for what was right. The quiet boy, who had once moved through the halls like a ghost, had become a young man who understood that real strength came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the courage to protect them and the wisdom to know the difference.